Okay, we chose the book The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and then we analyzed chapter 13. Yes, and then we made a short resume of the chapter 13. So Dorian Gray takes his old friend Basil Hallward to an upstairs room. He then shows Basil an old painting that Basil painted of Dorian. Basil is in disbelief of the alterations of the painting. Dorian tells him the truth about the changes, and Basil's reaction to the truth gives Dorian an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for his longtime friend, and he actually ends up killing Basil.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the genre of this story novel, but mainly the chapter we have written, which is chapter 13. We classify this chapter and book as a gothic horror fiction story and a philosophical fiction story. But mostly the story is horror because horror is characterized by the environment and this kind of supernatural element used in a story, which you also see in this story, where the picture I have on my slide is a picture of Dorian Gray, and half of his face kind of like a horrific person to look at, because he says that it resembles his soul, and the picture is just turning more and more horrific to look at. But gothic horror is used to kind of create this horror, so we as a reader is meant to be kind of scared about what we're reading and give this like thrill and suspense while we are reading. And there's a lot of things in this novel and chapter 13 that remind us about this gothic horror fiction. And also for the elements, we know that they're in a house, and in this house there's a room where the characters are in, and that is talked about as an old room, a dusty room, a room that haven't been used in a long time, and that also kind of gives us as a reader what can you say, a kind of horror type vibe when we're reading and hearing about this environment they are in.
Okay, and I will talk about the composition. Yes. The story starts in medias res. He passed out of the room and began the ascent, and Basil Hallward following close behind. And when a story starts in medias res, it helps capture the reader's full attention. You get sucked into the story from the start, and then you just want to keep reading. And there are also flashbacks in the story. For example, like when Dorian reveals the self-portrait Basil painted of him, Basil doesn't believe that he painted the picture, but Dorian reminds him of when he did and why he did it, and Basil did it because he was astonished by Dorian's beauty. And then we hear here in this example: years ago when I was a boy, said Dorian Gray, crushing the flower in his hand, you met me, flattered me, and taught me to be vain of my good looks. Yeah, that is a flashback that we hear. And there are also many more, but yeah. And it's also a chronological story. We follow Dorian Gray as he and Basil Hallward go into the room until he is in the library. Like, we follow Dorian Gray's action in the same timeline that he does it, so we only just get a few flashbacks. Yeah. Yes, and the setting and atmosphere in this story is, like in the chapter we read, the atmosphere, or like the setting, is an old abandoned room in the Victorian area in England. The room looked as if it had not been lived in for years. A faded Flemish tapestry, a curtain picture. a curtain picture. Can you see it? Okay, an old Italian cassone and an almost empty bookcase. That was all that it seems to contain, besides a chair and a table. And we can like, all in all, just the setting and atmosphere in this chapter, it sounds very like upper class England. And yeah, he also mentions that some men were like murdered in England, so we know the story takes place there.
I'm going to talk about the narrator of this story, chapter 13. We classify the narrator as a third person narrator because this person do not exist in the events that are happening in the story and is not a real character. And it's kind of like where the person telling the story is a fly on the wall watching the actions take place. And when it's a third person narrator, the person telling the story is also more observing and kind of like taking all the actions and events in, and while doing so also telling us as reader the thoughts of the different characters in these events at the time and also through a whole book. So when it's a third person narrator, it's also harder for us as a reader to kind of relate to the characters and the thoughts of the characters because we don't get their point of view. So it can be harder to relate and understand their situation and why they are doing what they're doing and thinking what they're thinking.
A characterization of Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray has a very youthful look despite his age. He is therefore described as a very handsome young man throughout the novel. Dorian makes many bad decisions throughout the novel to keep up his youthful look. He is also not influenced by the painting of himself deteriorating as time passes by. Dorian's relations to others. Dorian has a relation to Basil. They have a good relationship until he shows Basil the painting and Basil spoke his mind. Dorian was then filled with rage and then murdered Basil. Dorian also has a relationship to his personal driver Francis, and that relationship is formal. Dorian Gray's personality is described directly. He has become a man who doesn't care about others than himself. This goes to show when Dorian mercilessly killed Basil in the attic. Dorian Gray doesn't have a lot of values, especially towards others. He's also manipulating as he tries to convince Basil that what he did was a good thing.
I also have a quote where he talks about his soul, and it says, "So you think that it's only God who sees the soul, Basil? Draw the curtain back and you'll see mine." Which kind of, when I read this, I kind of get a voice in my head telling me it's told with a deep and kind of a voice that wants to be scary when you read it, and that when we as a reader get that kind of impression of the quote from the chapter, it is supposed to kind of give us a what's it called? It gives us a we maybe get an idea of that something bad is going to happen because it talks about his soul in a kind of dark way, and foreshadowing is used to create a thrill and suspense for us as a reader when we are reading the chapter or story or novel what we are reading. And because when it's used we do not know what's going to happen, or we maybe have an idea what could happen when we kind of realize what something is when when we're realizing what is going on in the action taking place. And when we do not know what is going to happen, we get this need and interest in learning what is going to happen. So we want to read more and more of the story until we finally know what happened. So that's foreshadowing.
The theme. The primary theme in the text revolves around moral decay, the consequences of one's choices, and inner conflicts. The themes are expressed through character interactions and narrative elements. The theme moral decay is expressed by his self-portrait. In the text, we hear about how the portrait keeps on decaying. This is a reflection of Dorian's soul. The inner conflicts are expressed when Dorian talks to Basil in the attic. Here we see Dorian struggling with the consequences of his actions, and we get a hint that he has a growing sense of guilt within himself.
So the story ends with Dorian stabbing Basil to the death, and then he followed with making sure that no one has heard his murder. Then when he was satisfied that no one heard the murder, then he hides Basil's belongings in a secret compartment in the wall. And after that he walks quietly out on the street, and after a few moments he returns, walking his servant, trying to create like the impression that he has been out all night. Then his servant reports that Basil has been to visit, and that now Basil is on his way to Paris, to which Dorian says that he is sorry that he has missed him, to make sure that no one suspects him of the murder.